And here's the thing, vitamin D is not a vitamin, it's a hormone. It has a huge effect on your immune system, whether you're going to get cancer or not, whether you're going to get an autoimmune disease or not, is dependent on your vitamin D status, how much time you spend in the sun or whether you take a pill or not.
And so when you think about like the most common client in your practice, would you say there are like 3 things they could start doing right now?
Take vitamin D3. So simple, so cheap, so easy.
Hi there, Dr. Gibbs. Welcome back to our podcast. First of all, let's dive right in talking about what was the first challenge, I guess, in your practice as a traditionally trained physician that began your journey of exploration outside of the more conventional model?
That's a biggie. Well, anyway, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. As you mentioned, I'm an otolaryngologist by training, and I was also very quickly interested in allergy as an ear, nose, and throat specialist. Mm-hmm. But what I found when I really first started was that everybody that I saw couldn't be fixed by surgery and medications. And when I would send out to the general allergist, the patient would come back with a prescription. And I'm like, no, you need to go deeper than that. You've got food sensitivities. You've got this allergy. You need to be on shots. You have mold sensitivities, blah, blah. And so I was already, even 1 or 2 years into my private practice, I was looking for kind of out of the box solutions for my patients. Mm-hmm. And I was also, ENT, part of core ENT is that we remove people's thyroids. And I would get people in and, you have this nodule, we have to take it out, blah, blah, blah. 90% of the time, the pathology would come back as benign, adenomatoid nodule, goiter nodule. And I'm like, what can we do? Can we do something about this? Do we have to be doing these surgeries on these people? Is it really necessary? And so I started looking into, can I use thyroid hormone to suppress the growth of a thyroid nodule? And I didn't know at the time much about Hashimoto's. As a matter of fact, it kind of wasn't on my radar barely at all. But I started seeing, the pathology would say lymphocytic thyroiditis. And so I'm like, what is that? Oh, well, okay, that's Hashimoto's disease. Well, what do you do about Hashimoto's disease? And we're like, well, nothing. And I'm like, well, that's not helpful.
Sure, absolutely.
That is not helpful. But, the thing that was the really big kicker, and this was about, 4 or 5 years into my private practice, I was at an allergy conference. And the guy started in on thyroid physiology and what it was like to, what are all the symptoms of low thyroid? And by the time he finished with that list, I was having to pick my jaw up off the floor because I was like, holy cow, he's talking about me. Mm-hmm. He's talking about me, and my basic training about thyroid was, well, you have to be tired and fat and have a big neck to have hypothyroidism. And that's, I found out very quickly that that's not at all true. I was never overweight. As a matter of fact, my response to being exhausted was that I wasn't hungry. I'd rather sleep than eat. And so I was never overweight. But when I went to that guy and I said, okay, I believe you. I think I have this. What do I do? And he said, here, take this, do this, do that. And it was like this miracle because looking back on my life, I don't know when I felt normal. Until I felt normal, I had no idea what normal felt like. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I had always been exhausted. I had always been cold. I had always had trouble sleeping. I'd always woken up in the night with sweats, constipated, dry skin, thin hair, you name it. I had all those symptoms. I didn't even have eyebrows. I mean, I had all those symptoms and it was just like this, pop on the face, I was like, oh my gosh. And once you see that list of symptoms and once you know what that list of symptoms looks like, you can't unsee it. And so I started recognizing it in all these patients that would come through the door and all those patients that had their recurrent sinusitis. And I'm like, yeah, you need this sinus surgery, but let me look at your thyroid some and let's see what we can figure out. And the funny thing was, the first time somebody came back 6 months later and said, oh, that sinus surgery we were going to do, I don't need it anymore. My sinus problems are gone. I just need a refill on that thyroid medicine you were giving me.
Mm-hmm.
That was another one. It was like, holy cow, I'm really onto something here.
Yeah.
And, the more I knew, the more I wanted to know, the more I realized, oh my God, I really don't know what I need to know here. And so I went looking for the education and I went looking for the explanation. Why are so many people who are already on thyroid medicine not feeling well? Why are so many people who look like they have hypothyroidism not even diagnosed? It was a process, and not only an education process for me, but a learning process for, it's okay for me to experiment on me.
Mm-hmm.
Doing something that I don't really understand, but I don't, I'm a classically trained physician. I first do no harm, don't experiment on people.
Mm-hmm.
And so until I really had an explanation for why what I was going to do was going to help them, I didn't feel comfortable. But then once I had that, it was like, okay, I know you're here for your allergies, but I see that you've had 4 miscarriages. Let's try this. And the next thing I know, they've got a baby. And I'm like, whoa.
So now you have a private practice. We'll talk about the details of that in just a moment. So many of our listeners are traditionally trained health and wellness professionals who are kind of in the corporate healthcare model, and they want to make a transition out of that model. And I think what you're saying, it was very organic in your circumstance. It was actually turning the mirror on your own healing first. So if a practitioner feeling symptomatic, that might be a really interesting them to start seeking other models of healing.
Yeah, and that story comes around over and over and over again. So like I have a friend who treats mold illness. Well, she was a pediatrician. She would have never gotten into mold illness except for somebody in her family got extremely sick from the mold that they had contamination in their house after Superstorm Sandy a while back. And did not get relief in the traditional setting. And so she was the same way. She's like, okay, I have to go learn this.
Yeah.
I have to figure this out. And now that's all of what she does.
Yeah. So I think that passion is really a valuable part of the transition. Would you say?
And it's passion, but it's also necessity.
Mm.
I mean, I have no idea where I would be right now if I had not figured out. I mean, I never had abnormal TSH. I mean, I had all the symptoms, but nobody diagnosed me. Nobody diagnosed me. And so I almost think it takes some kind of personal experience, some kind of personal epiphany to get you out of this, I have to stay in my box. I am a pediatrician or I am a whatever, and I can't step beyond that. Well, the truth of the matter is, and I'm speaking about physicians because that's the world I know, but physicians are trained in critical thinking and they are trained one of the things that we learn to do is learn. And so who's to say learning has to stop the minute you walk across the stage? And, that's silly.
Of course. Yeah. And so there's a sense, I think, too, in my experience and that of many of my colleagues who have transitioned into a more integrative model, is that breaking out of the box is challenging because you're having to not necessarily unlearn things, but layer your learning in a different way, read new
Yeah.
research that you weren't originally trained with, keep up with
Mhm.
research evolution, look at
Gosh,
other,
yes.
look at other things that you didn't learn in school. But then doing that, I think the personal story can be so important, because when you've actually experienced it in your own body, you have this confidence that you're right, even if it's not what you were taught.
Mhm. Yes, and also, I mean, like I said, for me, I really was not going to experiment on people. I
Sure.
had to find data that backed up what I figured out, which was that basically that not paying attention to reverse T3 and to the balance of the different hormones and the interaction of thyroid with adrenal, with insulin, with your immune system, with everything else. That ignoring that and siloing those things into different boxes where each of those different things is handled by a different specialist and never the twain shall meet
Mm-hmm.
is something that is wrong with medicine today.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it prevents us from seeing a person as a whole person.
Yeah.
Does
And
that
I
make
think
sense?
that's,
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's so hard because the entire system is set up in subspecialties, and
Yeah.
it's a little bit, it's challenging enough to learn all of the, keep up with the research in the field that you're focused on, in the
Right.
lens that you have, that pulling together multiple sources of education and information, even thinking from ENT to allergy to immune health to that being
Mhm.
integrated with endocrine health is, four different subspecialties in a traditional model.
It's true.
Because
It
it
is
is hard
true.
to learn all of that. So,
Yeah.
but I do think you're exactly right that obviously the more that we look at sort of root causes rather than just here's a prescription for antihistamines or, something to sort of quiet the symptoms, or,
Mhm.
hormonal birth control can often be a hormonal mask. We do have these sort
Mhm.
of pharmaceutical symptom management tools. But if you're going to go deeper, your practice has to evolve more integratively. So now you have broken out of the model. You have
Mhm.
created your own integrative practice in
Mhm.
Texas, right? You're in Dallas,
Yeah, in
Texas.
Texas, yeah.
Yeah. And so talk about, you now work with those patients who also fall through the cracks between the different specialties.
Yes.
So what is the kind of patient? What is she or he dealing with where they're not finding the answers that they make them the perfect client for you?
Oh gosh. Okay. So my perfect client has several off that list of symptoms that I started with.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been to their doctor. Sometimes they've been to a bunch of doctors and been told, oh, everything's fine. You're all good. You don't need, or here, take this levothyroxine. It'll make you feel better. And it doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
so they're kind of in one of those two silos. They've been told that nothing's wrong with them, which, that's just, it's gaslighting, whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it. It's gaslighting.
Yeah.
It's dismissive. It's, your symptoms aren't real. I mean, and women get that everywhere, not just with thyroid, but it's hard to be taken seriously as a woman with symptoms, and it's hard enough. But then when you have something that doesn't show on the standard test, then it's worse. And so those are the folks that I want. And they've done research. Now Europeans are better at doing this kind of research than we are here in the US. But when people are given the choice between taking levothyroxine and taking a different combination thyroid product to replace their thyroid, when the mainstream thinks it's necessary, mind you,
Mm-hmm.
um, a good 30% of those people prefer the combination therapy. But the mainstream docs have not figured out why that is. They haven't figured out how to structure it so that it's safe, that it's helpful, so that they can follow it with something that makes sense. And that's a big part of what I do. But when you look at those people, and not all of them have Hashimoto's disease, but autoimmune disease is a big, big hunk of that. And of course, that's 80, 90% women as it is. There are genetic overlaps between inability to produce T3 hormone, which we can go into more what that is in a minute if you want to, inability to produce enough T3 hormone in your body, and insulin resistance, for example. And what is insulin resistance? Well, that's, the genetic defect that makes you end up having diabetes, but causes all kinds of problems between I'm 17 and I feel great and diabetes when you're 45 or whatever.
So there's that genetic vulnerability, but it's not expressed often for decades.
It is expressed, but your body is still strong enough to overcome it. And so you don't realize until you've got the neuropathy, until you've got the kidney damage, until you've got, people, when they are diagnosed with diabetes, many, many, many of them already have eye damage, kidney damage, neuropathy, obesity, all these things. Then it's like, if it was recognized right away and taken care of. And how do you take care of it? With what you eat. Hello. If it was taken care of at the first and you developed, this is the way I need to eat for my body, then you would never get those side effects. And some of those are not reversible once you have them. And you don't wait until the day you have diabetes to start getting those. But that overlaps with thyroid problems a ton in a genetic way, but also in other ways that are more complicated and not as well understood.
So let's talk about some of the nerdy details of the thyroid.
Okay.
So if you have a client who comes in with that generalized fatigue, cold, heat intolerance, night sweats, hair loss, even eyebrow loss, skin fragility, all of the different common and not so common symptoms of thyroid dysfunction, weight loss, weight gain, just depends on how it manifests. What are some of the things you're looking for to, first of all, test? So more clinically and nerdy. And then what are some of the drivers of those things at a deeper level?
Oh, wow. That's a lot of stuff. Okay. Well, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a really complete history. And I want to know stuff all the way back to, I was premature. I had a nuchal cord. I was sick a lot with strep when I was, 4 years old and had to have my tonsils out and tubes in my ears. My parents got divorced. I witnessed domestic violence. I was abused. There are so many things that play into how your hormones work in the present that have to do with what happened to you in the past. I think there are viruses that can trigger the start of that. There's this idea that, you can continue to have an active infection in your body and that's causing Hashimoto's disease. I think that's kind of wrong. I think those viruses may be part of what triggers the disease in the first place, but it's not the only reason. The other things I'm looking for are, how do you handle stress today? What are the other symptoms you have? Do you have menstrual problems? Have you had a miscarriage? Have you had a bunch of miscarriages? How healthy were your parents? How healthy are your brothers and sisters? How healthy are your kids? There's so many different things to look at. And then, are you of menopausal age? Could you also be into perimenopause, which is a problem in people with thyroid imbalance? They will, in their early mid 30s, sometimes become amenorrheic. Hello. Is that really perimenopause, or is your thyroid just so messed up that that's what it's doing to you? So I need to know all of that. And then when I head into doing the testing, there are several different categories of tests that I go to. So I do a complete set of thyroid, and we can talk about what that means. But I'm also looking at, okay, do you make enough cortisol? Do you make enough cortisol, but your signal molecules for cortisol are off the charts? Do you make not enough cortisol? Do you make it at the wrong time of the day? Do you have enough vitamin D in your body? And here's the thing, vitamin D is not a vitamin, it's a hormone.
Yeah.
It has a huge effect on your immune system, whether you're going to get cancer or not, whether you're going to get an autoimmune disease or not, is dependent on your vitamin D status, how much time you spend in the sun, or whether you take a pill or not. I look at insulin levels, and I look at other signals that could tell me there's not a great test for insulin resistance. Unfortunately, I wish there was, just here's a quick yes or no, you have insulin resistance, but there's not, unfortunately. Right. So I'm looking at things like the fasting insulin level, a fasting glucose level. I'm looking at your uric acid. I'm looking at your sex hormones, and I want to know them on a specific day of the month within your cycle so that I can tell, are you at an average level for where you ought to be at your age, or are you higher? Are you lower? So kind of those are the four. So we got cortisol, we got thyroid, we got insulin, and then we got sex hormones, and then vitamin D and other supplements. And there's things like there's a genetic inability to process folic acid. And so that can create anemia and B vitamin deficiencies that are not good for your mitochondria and other things that are, cellular processes that are kind of indirectly related to hormones. But anyway, so I have a whole lot of real basic stuff that I kind of look at. And then one at a time, we start fixing what we see. And I do want to know if they've never had an autoimmune test for Hashimoto's disease or for Graves' disease. I want to do that too, just because that it plays a role in how your body processes and metabolizes thyroid hormone. Whether or not you have enough.
Right. Then how does your immune system interact with that? And
then how is your immune system interacting with that? And so on. Yeah.
And so for Hashimoto's or Graves, you're testing things like antibodies, correct?
Yes. So there's a set of antibodies that I test, and if somebody comes in and says, I already had these tests, then I'm like, okay, cool. We know you have Hashimoto's. Let's work on some other stuff first and get you a little bit of energy, and then start working on, okay, can we get those antibody levels to drop, which, and I'm using them as a marker for inflammation in your body, because we don't really know what turns antibodies on, what turns antibodies off in specific. There are a lot of people who get diagnosed with Hashimoto's and then it just goes away and we don't know why. It's like, why does one person have it come and then go, and another person it comes and then it gets worse and then worse and worse and worse and gradually destroys your thyroid gland? We don't know.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so, as you mentioned earlier, your TSH, which is the standard one thyroid marker that's measured in, primary care and even a lot of endocrinology practices. What is your complete thyroid panel, even if someone's TSH is normal?
I always test the free hormone levels, so the free T3 and free T4. And within the quote unquote normal range, there is an ideal range that I really look for and go for on those two. But I also test total T3 and then reverse T3. The thing so general endocrinologists ignore the effect of reverse T3, and they say it's an inactive molecule. It doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything. I really, really don't believe that, because I measure that total T3 and that reverse T3. And the reason I have to have the total T3 is because reverse T3 is also a protein bound number. And maybe I need to step back and explain what that means a little bit.
Yeah. So describe the difference between, so we have TSH that converts to T4, which is the...
So TSH is a brain hormone.
Correct.
It's a trophic hormone. It comes from your pituitary gland, tells your thyroid either, the more of it there is, it's like it's driving your thyroid, make more, make more, make more. And it's a little bit paradoxical because the lower the TSH is, the less thyroid hormone is driven to be produced. And the higher it is, the more thyroid hormone is driven to be produced. But the higher that number is, means your thyroid gland is sicker.
Right. Because it's like
unable to produce
it's not
more.
Producing it. So the brain is saying, produce more, produce more, produce more, which is why we need more. That's why the TSH will look high. So it may not look high. I think the other thing to note for people is that the range for TSH, which is that hormone that's produced by the brain, is often... the normal range on a standard lab test is often much higher than the research, even from back in 2015, states as more optimal, which is, say, 2 versus 5.
Yeah, I could talk all day about that because I think there's a political issue with it. The way they chose the reference range for TSH is just, if they chose it the way that they choose the reference range for other lab tests, then 50 million more people would be diagnosed with hypothyroidism just like that.
Interesting. What's the difference between that and how normally it's chosen?
Well, okay. So for example, here's how they choose what a reference range is. They take a whole bunch of people. So like if we're talking about LabCorp, and I'm just using them as an example.
Sure. Just a standard lab. Yeah.
Then we say, okay, LabCorp, go out and find 5,000 people to test. And said they pick all their employees. And they say, okay, you employees, you're going to take a questionnaire, and every one of you who's normal, we're going to test your TSH. We're going to put you guys all in a giant bucket and stratify you out from low to high. We're going to cut off 2.5% of you at the top end, 2.5% of you at the bottom end. And then halfway in between there is what we're going to say is the mid-range. And what happened when they did that was that they got 1.5. That was the median number, 1.5, 1.5. And so when they cut off their top and their bottom, they're, so that they've got now a 95% confidence interval. That's what they call that. Then it went from 0.5 to 2.5. So 1.5 is in the middle. But they said, oh, well, that leaves too many people abnormal. So we're going to put it up to 4.5 instead for some arbitrary, Lord only knows reason that it's just like, why did they do that?
Yeah. Yeah. And as we know, as you know, I'm sure, like we have actual data that also shows the more optimal range is around that same number, 1.9 to 2.5. Yeah.
Around 1.5. And that's about where it probably ought to be for most people who aren't taking thyroid medicine. But anyway.
Okay. So as it is, the number is a little bit wrong, but the idea is the same. TSH gets released. If it's very high, it's just working hard by the brain to trigger the thyroid to release.
Yeah, it's
T4.
flailing your poor old dying horse of a thyroid gland. It's basically what's happening. But anyway, so your thyroid gland produces T3 and T4. Those are the two main thyroid hormone molecules. T4 has 4 iodine molecules on it. T3 has had one of the iodines knocked off, and that becomes important in a minute. So 90-10, 90% T4, 10% T3 is spit out of your thyroid gland into your bloodstream. And if your thyroid is normal, that's a nice, steady, it happens, it's nice and steady, and it's pretty much the same all the time. If you have Hashimoto's disease, what you get is up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, because your body's fighting those antibodies. And sometimes it's being damaged and it releases a whole bunch. And then it's like trying to recover and it doesn't release much of any. And then up, down, up, down. And those fluctuations are important. Those fluctuations in those hormone levels are important. But anyway, so we've got T4, we've got T3. Well, the 10% of T3 that your thyroid hormone releases is only about 20% of what your whole body needs of active T3, because T3 is the active hormone the one that actually stimulates your cells to produce energy, to produce heat, to create new cells, to create new proteins, new antibodies, new this, new that. So your cells have to make their own T3 out of the T4 that's circulating around in your body. Those two hormones circulate through your blood bound to different proteins. And the reason they have to be bound to different proteins is because it's a little bit like oil and water. So your blood is watery, and thyroid hormone is oily, and it wouldn't mix in your blood right if it didn't have those proteins to make it dissolvable. So we've got the total amount, which is bound and not bound, and then we got the free. We measure the free because that's kind of more accurate at the cellular level.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the reverse T3, here's the deal about reverse T3. You guys are getting a big science education today. Reverse T3 is the other version of T3 that's made from T4. And reverse T3 is almost exactly like T3, except that the wrong iodine molecule got knocked off. So it's like a key that you went to the hardware store and got made, a new key for your front door, and you put it in the lock and it fits in the lock, but it's not quite right, so it doesn't turn. And that's reverse T3. So if your body makes reverse T3, and there are several reasons why it would do that, and the reverse T3 gets in your cell and gets on that receptor to do the thing it's supposed to do, it sits there on the receptor, but it doesn't do anything.
Right. So it's also blocking the receptor.
It's blocking the T3. And so the more reverse T3 you have in relation to the T3. So if you've got a lot of one and a little of the other, you're okay. But the closer they get together, the more the activity of the T3 gets blocked. And so you can measure that. And reverse T3 is ordinarily such a tiny, tiny amount that the test for reverse T3 is only done as total. There's no free reverse T3 test. And so we have to have something to compare it with, which is why I get the total T3.
That makes sense. And then you can essentially pull out the others. Yeah.
They're comparable. They're not exact, but they're comparable enough to be useful rather than me measuring all the different kinds of protein levels and trying to do a calculation. It's just easier to just get the total T3. And then that gives me a very simple ratio. So like if the T3 to RT3 ratio is 10-1, then that's pretty good. The ideal is about 12 up to about 14. So between 10 and 14 is pretty good. But on average, I would say my patients come in at a level of 5, 4. I've even seen as low as 2.5. And those patients feel terrible. They feel awful.
Yeah. Now, you talked about your own health journey where, that you ask your clients sort of as young as even, premature birth or common childhood illnesses. And you said even when you were a teenager, you never felt well, you never really felt good until after you had treatment. What are some of the root kind of foundational things that people can do if they're, their whole lives they haven't felt well? What are some of the basics that essentially our common environment is missing?
Well, okay. So one of the things, and this is actually the one that I suspect is me, is that there is a common genetic, I don't want to call it a defect exactly, but there's a genetic variant, a SNP, that is present. And I've seen different studies that say it's only 10% of people up to 32% of people, depending on your nationality and your descent, that makes your body not convert T4 to T3 as efficiently. And if you have that genetic variant, then not only do you not convert T4 to T3 as efficiently, but you make a lot more of that reverse T3. And then the other things that trigger elevated levels of reverse T3 are stress, high cortisol, high insulin, and fluctuations in thyroid hormone, which is what we just talked about is wrong with people with Hashimoto's disease. And then So it's like, okay, so what of those things are preventable? Well, you can manage your stress.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes. Most, I mean, and it's funny because people are like, oh, well, but my life is my life. And I'm like, yeah, but you can manage your perception of your circumstances.
Absolutely.
And that's, mind, body, medicine. There's so much there.
Yeah.
Once again, I could talk all week about that. But there's some other really, really simple things to do with a nutrition that you can do. You can make sure you're getting enough iodine and selenium in your diet. Those are two really, really important minerals for thyroid production. We do things, as a society that we think are really good ideas at the time that turn out maybe not to be such a good idea, like fluoridated water, for example. Fluoride displaces iodine in your thyroid gland. Hello. So then it's not as efficient at making thyroid hormone.
Because you need those 4 molecules of iodine, and then you need selenium to convert and
exactly. Yeah. So there's other nutritional things. There's other minerals that you need. There's zinc. There's magnesium, and protein, and there's, I don't know. Nutrition is complex, and we could talk about that all month if you wanted to.
Well, and so for many of your clients, there probably are some of those foundational nutritional things that they need to at least try to give some attention to, even though
yeah, absolutely.
The environment, certainly our food is less mineralized than it used to be. Our water has to be filtered so much that it's less mineralized, or it's somewhat toxic.
Yeah.
You kind of have the choice of more toxins or not enough minerals. And so these are sort of general environmental issues that people need to have some awareness of so that they can change how they're hydrating, clean the fluoride out of their water. And so when you think about like the most common client in your practice, would you say there are like 3 things they could start doing right now that would start to turn the needle until they actually were getting like a good clinical diagnosis?
Take vitamin D3. So simple, so cheap, so easy. And, you can't, here's a myth. People have this misunderstanding about autoimmune diseases. And they're like, I can cure my autoimmune disease. And there are doctors on the internet that are telling people that they can cure their autoimmune disease. And it's not really true. I mean, you can put an autoimmune disease into remission. You can remove, you can take it down to where there's no detectable antibodies in your system. But it's not a cure. That's not something we can say. Once you have an autoimmune disease, it's like type 1 diabetes. That's actually a very, very common autoimmune disease that happens. You can't turn that off once it's turned on. And you can't always undo the damage that disease has done, even if you can turn it off. And so people need to realize that, first of all. But if you have kids and you have an autoimmune disease, you should be doing every damn thing possible to prevent your kid from getting that autoimmune disease. And, the last statistic I saw was that 70% of children are vitamin D deficient, not just not enough, but deficient. And I was like, holy moly, that's crazy, and I'm thinking about my own kid. She doesn't go play outside. When I was 12, I still ran outside every day after school. I rode my bike around. I was out getting sunburned pretty much every day.
True. Yeah.
No, my daughter gets in. She sits in her room. She's on the computer. She's doing her homework. She doesn't get any sun.
Yeah.
She doesn't get any fresh air. She doesn't get any sun. And there's not enough, people are like, oh, well, my kid drinks vitamin D milk. Well, there's all kinds of things wrong with that. Besides the fact that the amount of vitamin D in vitamin D milk is very, very insufficient to do anything but maybe prevent rickets.
Right.
But a lot of the people that I see coming in, they'll have a vitamin D level of 7, 12. and 32 is the minimum. Now, I think they finally decided 32 is the minimum that's considered sufficient.
Yeah.
But I like it up. I like it up a lot higher than that. I like to see it above 65.
Yeah.
You're
Absolutely
not just
agree.
preventing autoimmune disease, you're preventing cancer.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of reasons to do that. And I think it does help people get their energy back. I think it helps them with, bone pain, muscle pain is a common presentation of low thyroid. And a lot of times if you get the person on the vitamin D, a lot of that will clear up. So it's like, wow, that's really crazy.
Really nice. Yeah.
Getting enough sleep. And here's the dilemma. Somebody with hypothyroidism may have as much trouble sleeping as I did.
Yeah.
I had a terrible time sleeping before I got on thyroid medicine.
Right. So that might be more of a chicken egg issue. You can do the behavioral things to help yourself, turn your screens off a few hours before bed, eat earlier, all of that, but it may not be effective enough until your thyroid hormones are in better shape.
Are a little more balanced. Yeah, exactly. And, some of the stuff that helps people manage cortisol that are really, really simple, like exercise, just get out and walk in the morning, go outside in the morning and in the evening and let unfiltered sun hit your eyeballs without sunglasses. There's research on that now that's super, super important for regulating your cortisol. And if your cortisol is high, then your thyroid and your reverse T3 in particular will be high. And your thyroid will be unbalanced just because of the cortisol.
Yeah, I think so many people don't understand that interaction between stress, physiologic stress, including circadian rhythms and all of that, and thyroid. You can't just like we talked about how we can't isolate everything in medicine. You can't really isolate the thyroid outside of the rest of the endocrine system.
That's absolutely true. So yeah, sleep, what you eat, mineral supplements, vitamin D, those are the biggies.
Yeah. And those are great. I think sometimes when people just recognize that like there are a few basic things you can do. And then how long did you feel like it took for you to feel well for the first time in your life after you began to implement all of these changes?
So I have to be honest, when I first started doing thyroid hormone, I didn't know to do all those other things.
Okay.
I just heard, if you get your thyroid hormone balanced, you'll feel better. And it was literally like flipping a switch for me. I mean, within a week, it was like, I didn't sweat all night. I didn't go to bed freezing. Because I used to lay in bed, and this is the God's honest truth. I would lay in bed with my feet so cold that I couldn't fall asleep for like an hour.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Until and very frequently I would have to get up, go in the bathroom, run a hot bathtub, sit in the hot bathtub and let my feet warm up and then race back to bed before I got cold again. And then I could fall asleep.
Wow.
But then I would wake up drenched in sweat and so my sleep was terrible.
Yeah. So it's almost like for you, and I think probably a lot of your clients, that while the entire healing can take a few months to a few years, there can be some initial shifts that then start what we call in our practice an upward spiral of healing, right? So once you were you got the thyroid medication on board and then you were able to sleep, then that's another layer of improvement. Then you have the energy to maybe change some of your nutritional habits.
Exactly.
It's like one little baby step after the other. It's the hard part's getting started.
Yes. Yeah. And truthfully, that's a lot of what I see is if somebody comes in and I find something that's really egregious wrong with their labs, or, I think it's egregious, even though every other doctor in the world would go, oh, those are normal.
Right. Right.
And I can give them a quick win. Then they have the energy to turn around and say, oh, well, you know what? I'm going to go for a 10-minute walk every morning. And the minute they start doing that, then it helps their circadian rhythm. And then they start, noticing that they're sleeping a little bit better and they have a little more energy. And, oh, I think I'll prepare a home cooked meal instead of ordering out. And yeah, you're right. It just builds gradually. There are some people where it's like a slot machine. It's like you put a quarter in, you put another quarter in, you put another quarter in, and then all of a sudden, and all of a sudden it comes. And then there are other people where it's very gradual, where it's like a teeny little win, and then, and they build, like you were saying, they build up on each other. But every now and then I will get a win that's just like, it's almost instantaneous. Like, I'm seeing a patient from last week, and she's one of these, I've got chronic thyroid. She's been on levothyroxine for a long time. And I said, okay, before I do your tests, I'd like you to do one thing. I'd like you to break your pill in half and take half of it in the morning and half of it in the evening. And she texted me 2 days later and says, I already feel so much better. And I'm like, what? That's so great. Yeah. Because what I did was I knocked off the high and low variability in her thyroid supplementation, which does what? It reduces the amount of reverse T3 that you make.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
and so
that's so encouraging.
Before she even went to the lab, she got a win. I was like, dang, that's great.
Yeah, I think that's so encouraging for people. And then on the flip side, I'm sure you work with patients long enough having a sort of chronic practice. One of the biggest challenges among my students, nutrition and health coaching students, is that when we're working a long time with people that have chronic illness and need to kind of maintain a relatively committed, let's say, level of lifestyle behaviors, getting outside every day, eating well most of the time, getting to bed early enough, those habits, while on paper as a little checklist, they're not really that hard. It's kind of, it's not that difficult. It makes sense.
Right.
But in the environment of social pressures and work schedules and all of that, 3 months into it, even though they're then feeling better,
and addictive devices. Hello.
Yeah. Right. I saw that study where, like, if your phone is like a certain distance from your thyroid, it's really not good. You have to keep it much further away.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'm just saying, just being on it all the time raises your level of anxiety, and it's just like, okay.
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
Turn it off. Stop watching the news.
All of that detail, I think, while it's sort of easy for us to be like, oh, just stop doing this, just change this, just do that. And then people do it initially, especially those first 2-3 months when they're feeling better. They're like, oh my gosh, this works. I'm going to keep doing it. And then, the holidays come around, or they go on summer vacation or something. What is some of your what's your number one tip to help people navigate when it gets hard?
Well, self-compassion is huge. That's the first one, is if you don't do all the things, don't beat yourself up for not doing all the things. Really have a little compassion. It's like, look, life is complicated. Life is hard. Oh, that's so understandable. It makes sense that your brain would offer you this, I don't have time, I don't have the energy, I don't blah, blah, blah. It makes sense. And so that's number one, is self-compassion. And then the second one is to get a coach to help you change how you think about what's going on with you. Because I see a lot of this victim mentality, where somebody's like, I'm a Hashimoto's patient. I identify as someone who is sick.
Yeah.
But you don't have to. You can change over time. And I'm not saying it's like flipping a switch. It's not. You can change your view of yourself to, I am a person who's committed to working out at the gym every week, twice a week. Or I am a person who doesn't drink alcohol because I know that it's horrible for my body and makes me sleep like crap. I am a person who prioritizes my health. And therefore I choose the egg sandwich instead of the donut, or, the chia seed smoothie instead of the, special K with milk on top, or I don't know, but
Sure. Just that shift in identity that once you have a diagnosis, I think we talk about this a lot in our trainings, because there's some real benefit to the community of that diagnosis initially, especially when you've been through a lot of the dismissal from all of the other
oh my
physicians.
gosh, yeah.
And you're like finally getting some validation and some understanding. But then unless that is coached in an appropriate way, that then opens up, like, hold space for that healing, compassion, support, acknowledgement, and then allows for the possibility that this diagnosis doesn't have to become an identity.
Yes, exactly. No, you're exactly right. That's exactly what I was getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think acknowledging that it is hard in our culture, because the culture's driving value is productivity. And if you have a energy limiting, physical challenge, disease state or not, it's hard to keep up with the culture of productivity.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, my personal story, which is out on the internet, I talk in episode 1 of my new podcast. I talk about that. I really had a terrible opinion of myself for years because, I'd been to doctors and they said, "You're fine, go away, take these antidepressants, everything's all good." And so I had this horrible opinion of myself as a lazy human being. And when I wasn't anymore, and I can have somebody point out, usually it's a coach who points out to me, "You know what, you work a lot of hours, you focus really, you're doing this," and and pointing out to me from an outside viewer's viewpoint of what I do and how I've accomplished it, my self idea was so messed up for years, even after I wasn't having the problems anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. It really sticks.
It really sticks. And I'm not sure how successful a person would be if they tried to just push that under the rug and get over it by themselves. I think that really just adds to your stress.
Yeah. Yeah. So having the coaching to just help you even notice where that's affecting you, because I think that's something that's pretty universal amongst anyone who's had this kind of an illness, even at any point in their lives.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and getting nerdy with us into the science. And what is your new podcast? And then where else can our listeners find you?
Sure. So my new podcast is Beyond the Thyroid, and it's going to be very nerdy for a while because I'm really kind of trying to present the basic science of thyroid in a way that's digestible and understandable to someone who's not science trained.
Nice.
But I'm also going to get in there and tell stories of coaches and other providers and practitioners. And so I'm really enjoying it so far. We're working on episode 10 right now, so I'm getting there.
Nice.
But as far as the rest of where you can find me, my website is danagibbsmd.com. I'm on Instagram, danagibbsmd, Facebook. I am Consultants in Metabolism is my business page. And then I'm actually Dana Gibbs Clark on Facebook. So you can find me there as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gibbs. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for inspiring anyone who feels trapped and like they've been gaslit and dropped through the cracks of the very siloed traditional system. And hopefully they can find their way to come and see you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. This has been really fun. And I hope we get to talk again soon.
Excellent. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.